Now, without further ado, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our fireside. We are going to start with a short biography about Dr. Gerald Filson, and then we will be inviting him on to speak on tonight's subject. So, Dr. Gerald Filson served as the Director of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada from 1993 until he retired from his service in 2017. He is currently a member of the National Spiritual Assembly, the national governing body of the Baha'is of Canada. His education includes a PhD, MA, and BA, and he is born and raised in Saskatchewan. Dr. Filson taught school in Quebec from 1972 to 1979, and during the 1980s, he taught at Sheridan College and George Brown College, and worked for TV Ontario while completing his doctorate at the University of Toronto. He served as chair of the Canadian Network on International Human Rights, a coalition of more than 30 Canadian human rights organizations. He served 2 terms on the board of directors of the Couchiching Institute on Public Affairs and was the chair of its national conference in 2006 and 2007. He has recently served as the chair of the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, a national interfaith coalition of 40 organizations. Over the years, Dr. Filson has traveled widely for his work in South Africa and the Caribbean, and with repeated visits to India from 1996 to 2010, leading a project involving video and village development. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Gerald Filson to join us for the topic, the conceptual nature of human beings, the rational soul according to Bahá'u'lláh. Dr. Filson, please join us and very welcome.
Thanks very much, Homa. And I see all the number of people here and many friends, so I hope you will enjoy a bit of philosophy, because in this presentation I want to talk about the human mind, and I'll have some closing comments about the mind's relationship to the rational soul. And I do this by comparing Baha'i ideas to insights about the mind that come from contemporary philosophy. Because in my reading, I found some of those insights in philosophy to be helpful in their similarity to a Baha'i view of the mind. So I start by comparing animal rationality to the mind, as that is the easiest way for me to explain some of these philosophical insights, as well as Abdu'l-Baha's understanding of the human mind. there are currently 3 projects that are popular in the culture, projects about which many contemporary philosophers are quite critical. And these criticisms are not unlike the shortcomings in those projects that a Baha'i would have. The first project is the leveling of the human mind to merely an evolved animal rationality. The second project is the idea that a neuroscientific understanding of the brain is all that we need to explain consciousness and the mind. And the third project is the idea that artificial intelligence will overtake the powers of the human mind, as some sci-fi books and movies have it, even perhaps generating consciousness. These are what are called reductive explanations of the mind. And by my reading of philosophy and passages from Abdu'l-Baha and Bahá'u'lláh, those reductive projects are not credible and they don't stand by the light of reason. So here I say less about artificial intelligence, but refer you to philosopher Eric J. Larson's book published this year by Harvard University Press, titled The Myth of Artificial Intelligence: Why Computers Can't Think the Way We Do. Larson explains very well the difference between the human mind and artificial intelligence. Robert Pippin, a University of Chicago philosopher, summarizes well the views of many of his colleagues when he says, quote, "There's something about some human capacities that will never be explicable scientifically, no matter our eventual knowledge of feedback loops and brain reorganization." But before I discuss why the American philosopher John McDowell and Abdu'l-Baha both understand how different our minds are from animal rationality, I want to be clear about how necessary neuroscience and studies of animal rationality are. They are definitely helpful in our understanding of the mind, but they are not sufficient. They don't capture the mind in a way that gives a complete account of the nature of the human mind and its capacities. Like philosophers, Baha'is have immense respect for science as essential to human advancement. And so Baha'is recognize that the mind is to a large extent dependent on the health of the body and the brain. Abdu'l-Baha sent a wonderful letter on the subject of the mind in reply to Dr. Auguste Forel, a scientist and co-founder of the first neuron theory of the brain. And he wrote, quote, "For the mind to manifest itself, the human body must be whole, and a sound mind cannot be but in a sound body." At the same time, other comments in that letter of Abdu'l-Baha also made it clear that as necessary as scientific study of the brain is, it is not sufficient for a full understanding of the powers of the human mind. So now to the question of animal rationality. Since antiquity, of course, philosophy has compared human beings to animals, and John McDowell and Abdu'l-Baha both use this comparison in order to advance a sound understanding of the human mind. McDowell argues persuasively that the human mind has a conceptual way by which it knows and engages the world, while the animal responds to an environment. And if you think about this for a moment, a world and an environment are very different. Robert Pippin, again, summarizes well a common view in philosophy that human beings have, quote, "no naturally determined niche in the world of nature." There's no natural man, even though philosopher Rousseau invented that as a means merely to contrast it with the foibles of human beings in society. And certainly it's easy to agree with the Harvard philosophy professor Christine Korsgaard that while we characterize human beings as moral or immoral, we never describe animals that way. Although, curiously, a few centuries ago in rural France, animals were apparently put on trial for their crimes. But the absurdity of that speaks for itself. And as Abdu'l-Baha has noted, along with countless philosophers, the rapidity of changes in our human ways of life, in culture, changes in the arts, music, science, and other human endeavors are not only rapid changes, but they are accelerating. While there are only slight changes in animals' ways of life across the millennia of physical evolution, and any rapid change to their natural place in nature, we can now see often leads to their extinction. So this rapidity of human cultural evolution is due to the awareness or mind that is conceptually shaped, free and spontaneous in some degree. We know the world conceptually, and by that I mean that we rely on an enormous background of concepts that shape the world we have in view as we take in and engage with the world, whether it's physicality and material structure, or with the abstractions and realities that are of the human world, most of which are immaterial, if we think about it. For the institutions, norms, values, principles, language, and purposes and meanings of life are almost all abstract and conceptual. And by conceptual, I mean simply, to quote German philosopher Marcus Gabriel, a concept is simply something that means, by means of which we can distinguish something or some things from other things. The concept of a dog distinguishes dogs from cats, but also from lions and earlobes. And by concepts, we also distinguish indignation from anger, or generosity from kindness. And we also distinguish concept classes. By that, I mean that red is different from green, yet red is in the concept class of color, which is different than the concept class of texture. And we have learned since infancy thousands of concepts that shape the world we have in view, many nested within each other, and all more or less distinguished from each other. In other words, we know our world by way of the concepts we have learned and through which we make judgments about the world, perceive the world, and take actions within the world that we have in view. Animals may appear to reason in a manner that seems comparable to human reasoning, but they actually respond directly to an environment, not to a world. And they do so by often remarkable differential response repertoires that rely on their acute sensibilities, their sight, their sound, and their smell, and their excellent memory of environments. Memories which, as Abdu'l-Baha said, are often better than human memory, since, as we should note, human memory has a different function than strict fidelity to memory of the physical and the natural. So there is discrimination by animals that appears similar to our human discrimination by concepts, but for animals, it is not about abstract conceptual meanings, but about particulars in an actual physical or natural environment. It is not a world that includes the immaterial, the abstract, and that which is beyond the physicality of the world by which the human mind understands and navigates human realities. The animal's engagement is by way of biological needs, while human beings engage with the world, not a mere environment, and with purposes and projects that reach far beyond our biological needs. We also rely on several more capacities of mind and sensibility and memory. We have imagination, comprehension, language itself, and a different kind of memory, and a way of perception that is influenced by language and the conceptual, that multiplies 1,000-fold and more the combinations of concepts available to the human mind by which we know and engage a world. The language itself, whether by theory, analogy, metaphor, or novel expression, generates continually new ways of how we perceive and understand a world far beyond the environmentally constrained animal. And language, with its subject and predicate structure, gives us a powerful way of combining properties and objects, minds and properties, abstractions and particulars, adding to our working logic of identity, non-contradiction, and inferences of the sort, if X, then Y, which we rely upon even without being conscious of our reliance on that, just as we rely on syntax most of the time without pause or thought given to either the body of concepts that grounds our perceptions and judgments, nor giving any thought to the logic and the syntax through which our judgments and perceptions of mind flow. As the philosopher Donald Davidson comments, quote, language is a mode of perception. It is an ordinary learned skill, but it is essential to the other senses if they are to yield propositional knowledge. Language is an organ, in other words, of propositional perception. And Canada's preeminent philosopher, Charles Taylor's recent book, The Language Animal, expounds greatly on the way in which language widens and deepens our perceptual capacities. So we take in the deliverances of our experience by way of our senses, but in a manner that is always mediated by the conceptual in order for us to have any experience at all. There is an inseparable cooperation of sensibility and conceptuality that cannot be disentangled. To be receptive to the world, we rely on a conceptual idea of a world that is already there in mind, so that as we perceive and recognize features of the world, whether of objects or of human realities, they are then available for placement within the world we have in view, or close enough to allow relative adjustments to a world that shapeshifts as we gain further knowledge of it. This understanding of McDowell resembles the way Abdu'l-Baha explains our conceptual nature. Abdu'l-Baha writes that, quote, "The animal perceives sensible things but cannot perceive conceptual realities. Of this power of discovery which belongeth to the human mind, this power which can grasp abstract and universal ideas, the animal remaineth totally ignorant. The animal cannot conceive of intellect. Of these powers it is bereft. These powers are peculiar to man." And there are many, many other such passages like these from Abdu'l-Baha. See, for the animal, the two powers of sensation and memory work together, and they can exhibit impressive reasoning ability by way of differential responses, distinguishing elements that are particulars in the environment over repeated trials in animal training, or in responsiveness in its natural niche in an environment as it responds to biological needs. The human being, on the other hand, operates with vocabularies of tens of thousands of words and intricate rules of syntax. And even when we get words wrong or mangle syntax, our common sense way of thinking allows us to understand each other's utterances, as language is also accompanied by gestures and enactments. And this is especially true as the infant learns language. And more importantly, our way of mindedness, consciousness, and thought is also always accompanied by attitude, by attitudes or feelings. Now, this is one of the most profound ways our minds work, is that unlike artificial intelligence that operates on one logical level only, our human minds operate in informal ways on different levels at the same time, ways that always include attitudes and feelings that accompany our thoughts. There's an inseparable quality to the mind and little distance between, as we say, the heart and the head. There's little or no separation between the cognitive and attitude, which is an affective or an emotional commitment that accompanies our thoughts and judgments about the world, and none either between the purposeful or conative and the affective and the cognitive. There's always this multidimensionality to the mind as a feature of our human agency, our consciousness, our freedom and spontaneity within the constraints of the world we have in view, and which prompts our perceptions, our judgments, our affirmations, and our actions. This point is of importance in contemporary philosophy, so I need to explain it a little bit better. It comes from one of the great logicians and philosophers of the 19th century, Gottlieb Frege, who developed the first concept script that today serves as the basis of the digital revolution. But he was also the philosopher who realized that in our propositional judgments and utterances, we always attach attitude or normativity, which we might want to call human agency, to what we know, what we perceive, what we judge, or what we affirm. We cannot avoid having an attitude or feeling about what we know, perceive, judge, or affirm, as we take responsibility and we commit to such judgments or perceptions. We do so by our enthusiasm or our detachment, by our strong or weak affirmation, by our level of confidence or our tentativeness, our sincerity or our insincerity, and so forth. We cannot think without attitude accompanying, however implicitly and how usually not apparent to us, as our consciousness moves us along through our lives. So there is today in philosophy the realization that the mind is not really cognitive or intellectual, but one that has feelings as well as beliefs, attitudes that are themselves conceptual, even in our knowing the object world, as well as the world of principles, purposes, norms and standards, and all manner of human situations that we enter into, and the judgments and the actions by which we engage the world. The philosophers here at the University of Toronto, Ronald de Sousa and Martha Nussbaum at the University of Chicago, have written books on how emotion and feeling reflect how we take in and evaluate situations of life, however poorly our effective judgments have been educated, which is an area of great weakness in the current culture. De Souza calls the situations of life paradigmatic situations to which we respond with emotions, ones that we've learned from childhood, either again, well or poorly. But they do represent evaluations and judgments about the world. The title of De Souza's book makes the point. The rationality of emotion, as does Nussbaum's book title, Upheavals of Thought, the Intelligence of Emotions. And these books are far more insightful than that popular book a few years ago about emotional intelligence. A leading German philosopher, Rainer Forst, writes, quote, "Feelings are expressions of our beliefs and evaluations, not their opposite. Someone who did not have any moral feelings would not really be a participant in social evaluating practices." And Robert Pippin writes, quote, "A rational capacity to take up the view of the other is based on a deeper and more original affective capacity." Now, Andrea Kern of the University of Leipzig follows MacDonald's thinking about the conceptual nature of our rational capacity. Her book, Sources of Knowledge on the Concept of a Rational Capacity for Knowledge, points in the direction of Baha'u'llah's idea of the single reality of mind that I will read shortly, insofar as our rational capacity for knowledge brings together seamlessly in our self-conscious judgments and perceptions, our beliefs, our standards for truth, or our standards of the right, or standards of the good or the beautiful, if that is what we're judging or perceiving, and the background warrants for our beliefs about the world that also includes logic and syntax in our capacity for knowledge about a world by way of our perception, our judgment, and our actions. We know something, though we don't consciously bring those standards of truth, beliefs, concepts, and background to our judgments, unless we are questioned as to why we think we know something or why we took a particular action that we did. We were able to give reasons for them. Such ability to judge comes, of course, by learning to judge situations either as true and correct or incorrect by the person so judging. And it is always a self-conscious judgment, as our knowing something is always being conscious of knowing something, manifested by the use of concepts and explanations that are dependent on that very capacity. Now, here my language is a bit too philosophical, but the point is that judgments are about the consciousness of judging. And it is the self-consciousness of knowing that we judge truly or not. And we also learn to know too when we don't judge truly. Now, Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet about our rational faculty, and he used the term rational faculty, that is important to these considerations. He describes the role of the rational faculty as fundamental to the agency of mind, whose instrumentalities can be understood to a degree, even though its actual nature cannot be. And he begins the passage on page 164 of the Gleanings. "Consider the rational faculty with which God hath endowed the essence of man. Examine thine own self, and behold how thy motion and stillness, thy will and purpose, thy sight and hearing, thy sense of smell and power of speech, and whatever else is related to or transcendeth thy physical senses or spiritual perceptions, all proceed from and owe their existence to this same faculty. Were thou to ponder in thine heart," and note, he says we ponder or think in our heart with feeling and attitude, therefore, "if wert thou to ponder in thine heart from now until the end that hath no end, and with all the concentrated intelligence and understanding which the greatest minds have attained in the past or will attain in the future, this divinely ordained and subtle reality, thou wilt fail to comprehend its mystery or to appraise its virtue." Or there's another passage from Baha'u'llah from Summons of the Lord of Hosts where he writes, spirit, mind, soul, and the powers of sight and hearing are but one single reality, which hath manifold expressions owing to the diversity of its instruments. As thou dost observe, man's power to comprehend, move, speak, hear, and see all derive from this sign of his Lord within him. Among the followers I've mentioned here in my presentation, and others too, many have written about this integrity of the mind in which its reasoning and judgments and perceptual nature come together in inseparable ways. Though for such secular philosophy, the soul is not brought into the picture, and I will comment on that missing link later. But their understanding of the mind runs directly counter to the reductive explanations that the mind can be described and explained merely by knowing how the brain functions, or that our minds are similar to animal rationality, or that AI, artificial intelligence, can ever possibly model the human mind. The views of these philosophers see the mind as a unified set of capacities that integrate the power of sight and hearing and ways of reasoning that include a range of realities that make up the human world, realities that include our beliefs, our feelings, our attitudes, norms of behavior, purposes, intentions, and meanings in our lives, all of which are avenues of comprehension, imagination, and understanding, but which our human agency of consciousness and spontaneity of mind operate at a logical level above and beyond what natural or physical science can account for by mere description, an explanation of causal and extensional mechanisms. The idea I want to emphasize here is that the mind operates by reasoning through these multiplicity of realities, beliefs, feelings, attitudes, purposes, life meanings, and so forth, in order to arrive at the kinds of practical and moral judgments and actions we're then able to justify with reasons, whether good reasons or not. We always have reasons. Kant, in his early efforts to understand the mind in the terms of modern philosophy, called this integration of sensibility and conceptuality the unity of apperception, a term that always puts undergraduate students off philosophy. In today's language, we use terms such as cognitive penetration and the binding problem that are labels for issues that will continue to be insurmountable barriers to artificial intelligence and neuroscientific attempts to understand fully and completely the functioning of the mind. Our minds are able to bring into judgments and reasoning multiple streams of information, including our own sense of ourselves, our various roles in life, parent, whether a child, an employee, a friend, a member of this or that association, and we move through these different roles flexibly and naturally without pause, a capacity that is available to our minds. Now, Baha'u'llah's reference to our one single reality and yet to the diversity of its instruments captures well this idea that is alive in contemporary philosophy, that human reasoning has to manage multiple realities, all with different modalities, and that provide the background or horizon on which we ground our decisions and our reasoning about life. As Marcus Gabriel, the German philosopher, puts it, quote, whatever is real is integrated in a network of concepts. Every concept refers to another. If you know a concept, you thereby know a bunch of others too. This thesis is known as semantic holism and says that you're able to deploy a concept only if you're able to deploy a whole battery of further concepts that stand in various logical relations to it. And he writes further, our self-conception as minded reflects our value systems and our personal experiences. It has developed in complex ways in the tension between our understanding of nature, literature, legal systems, values of justice, our arts, our religions, socio-historical and personal experience. There just is no way to describe these developments in the language of neuroscience or AI that would be superior or even equal to the value vocabulary that we already have in hand when we talk about these things. Abdu'l-Baha reflects these views, I feel, when he writes that it is the human mind that generates, quote, the sciences, arts, inventions, crafts, and discoveries. For it is only physically that man resembles the lower creation. With regard to his intellect, he is totally unlike it. His mental activity flows through many and varied channels. Look what man has accomplished in the field of science. In the world of art, it is just the same. Now, though Abdu'l-Baha also understands the mind's varied channels, he also understands them as, quote, spiritual powers. And from some answered questions, he says these are powers of imagination, thought, and comprehension, and memory. These are spiritual powers. So we perceive and know the world by categories or concepts of thought And each scene or tableau that we come upon in our experience of life bring with it a manifold of sensations that we're able to
have this one.
by the elimination and reduction of the available information and the millions of sensory bits available to our senses, bringing to our experience an understandable world that we then have in mind and through which we're able to understand experience at all. The psychologist Timothy Wilson estimates that the brain is inundated with 11 million discrete bits of information per second, of which no more than about 40 can be consciously processed. That is the power of the mind and the power of our learning to manage a world, not simply an environment, but to manage a world by way of our conceptual view of the world. Now, as inseparable as these multiple capacities and realities of mind are, it is also very difficult to go beyond the conceptions that we have accumulated in our learning. And here, Baha'u'llah is also helpful in making a point that has also become commonplace in contemporary philosophy. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy in a way, asked the question, how do we grasp concepts? 2 centuries later, Hegel asked, how is it that concepts have such a grasp and hold on us? For our conceptual view of a world can really hold us prisoner. And this is clearly a question of importance. Baha'u'llah addresses this issue, anticipating this very problem when he writes, page 317 of Gleanings, to whatever heights the mind of the most exalted of men may soar, however great the depths which the detached and understanding heart can penetrate, such mind and heart can never transcend that which is the creature of their own conceptions and the product of their own thoughts. This captures very well McDowell's understanding of our conceptual view of a world by which we perceive a world by way of placing the deliverances of our sense perception and our understanding within that world that we have built up over the years of our learning about the world. And as Baha'u'llah points out, quote, these are limitations to which man's finite mind has been strictly subjected. The mind of the human being can never transcend that which is the creature of our own conceptions and the product of our own thoughts. This includes a limitation of mind that we cannot ever fully understand our own workings of the mind and the way in which the rational faculty operates. And again, this has to do with its connection with the rational soul, a point I'll come to later. But it also addresses how our own conceptions can hold us prisoner to assumptions of the world that we have in view and on which we rely. So at the same time, there's an emphasis in the Baha'i writings and literature on how we are always to be progressing in our own education about reality, that we should never stop investigating reality. And Baha'is have learned over the past 25 years just how much we have been able to learn, and we've learned to do that by practice, by actually doing things, by making mistakes and so forth. Or as Aristotle said in his Ethics, quote, for the things we have to learn before we can do, we learn by doing. And this is the way Abdu'l-Baha understands the process too. We take actions and then we learn. Paul Lample in his book, Revelation and Social Reality, draws attention to Otto Neurath's image of how we go about that work. And John McDowell uses exactly the same image in his view of human learning. We are, as it were, at sea on a raft or a boat that we have to rebuild one piece at a time while still staying afloat, replacing by bits and pieces one timber of the ship after another. And so with gradual adjustments, we come to learn new ways of thinking about the world. McDowell writes, quote, like any thinking required in our perception of the world and our actions in the world, like any thinking, ethical thinking is under a standing obligation to reflect about and criticize the standards by which at any time it takes itself to be governed. And he goes on, the required adjustments to the system depend on what we take experience to reveal to us, and we can capture that only in terms of the concepts and conceptions that figure in the evolving system. What we take experience to tell us is already part of the system, not an external constraint on it. And it is by perception and the more rigorous nature of action that we most successfully advance our learning. Such standards of human reasoning have to do with how we have learned by the accompaniment of others, by our family and friends, and by teachers. Standards or norms of how we judge correctness or truth about the world, standards of what is right, what is good, and what is beautiful. All concepts that impart to our self-conscious perception and judgments the standards and norms we rely on in having a world in view that then represents the best accounting we can muster for the facts, the values, the principles, and the standards we rely on. We do not, after all, first encounter a physical world of objects when we're first born. As babies, we come into a growing awareness and consciousness by way of a reality that involves people and their minds, as much more influential on the baby's early consciousness than on our first encounter with a world of objects. Babies meet mother, father, and significant others, and they experience their consciousness in immediate relationships of gestures and enactments that are powerful. Babies begin learning immediately through social practices that are mindful practices, not practices merely relative to a physical world, but engagement that involves relationships with other minds, their concepts, and their standards and norms, which are also concepts. Learning of the world in both its physical and mental features by way of a kind of triangulation between their minds, other minds, and the third reality of an object world, relying on others' first-person reactions and expressiveness regarding the object world, along with relationships of emotions, meanings, and intentionality with respect to their own awakening and burgeoning consciousness. As infants, we assume the only assumption would be available to us, given our complete dependency on other people, that others in their reactions to us, particularly mothers, as well as their reactions to objects, have minds and consciousness as we do. However open that consciousness is for newborn babies. Obviously, as infants, it's not so much a thought, but the first glimmerings of a world we wake up to over the years of our infancy as we learn a complexity of feelings and thoughts that is extraordinarily vast. It is the way of the human mind. Learning from our first word at 12 to 18 months to the age of 6, when we've got well over 10,000 words before school begins, learning rules of syntax and semantic usage, as well as logic, that builds to an enormous complexity on very thin evidence and experience. And it's not that one word is uttered and then another in a cumulative process of learning, but what we now clearly understand is a process of gestures, actions, enactments between mother and father and baby that builds a world of sense, a holistic picture that is grasped by the baby so that mama may be the first word, but it is expressed within a baby's understanding already of a whole world of previous interactive gesture and response with other minds that has been growing in the mind of the baby. This allows the baby to begin utterances in speech that are intimately tied to a blossoming world, a world where the sun comes up gradually, as it were, as the infant develops and learns. Now, Davidson writes and does so persuasively of how we have two languages. This is Donald Davidson, a California philosopher, one about the physical realm and one that is about the mental realm, and how we use these two languages, neither of which he feels can be translated into the other, and we do so without pause or deep reflection. We do so in conversation and in how we go about our lives. Abdu'l-Baha agrees to an extent, and Abdu'l-Baha writes, quote, "Human knowledge is of two kinds. One is the knowledge acquired through the senses, that which the eye, the ear, or the senses of smell, taste, or touch can perceive is called sensible. These are called sensible realities, or Davidson's language of the physical realm." And Abdu'l-Baha goes on, "The other kind of human knowledge is that of intelligible things. That is, it consists of intelligible realities which have no outward form or place, and which are not sensible. For example, the power of the mind is not sensible, nor are any of the human attributes. These are intelligible realities. Love, likewise, is an intelligible and not a sensible reality. For the ear does not hear those realities, the eye does not see them." And he continues, "But when you undertake to express these intelligible realities, you have no recourse but to cast them often in the mold of the sensible. For outwardly, there is nothing beyond the sensible. Thus, when you wish to express the reality of the spirit and its conditions and degrees, you're obliged to describe them in terms of sensible things. For example, for grief and happiness, you say, 'My heart becomes heavy.'" And this is Abdu'l-Baha writing. Or my heart was uplifted, though one's heart is not literally made heavy or lifted up. Another example is when you say so-and-so has greatly advanced, although he remains in the same place. Or so-and-so has a high position where, like everyone else, he continues to walk upon the earth. Now, what is striking here is the way that Abdu'l-Baha anticipated current philosophical thinking about the mind, and certainly about language, as Charles Taylor discusses in his book, The Language Animal, and how through metaphor, analogy, as well as theory, we advance our ways of perceiving the world. Now, in considering the issue of language, and because of shortness of time in this quick canvas of some philosophical insights that match up with Baha'i concepts, I want now to jump to a consideration of the astonishing breadth and depth of the language of Baha'u'llah's revelation, and how it can be helpful in providing the kind of language necessary to our learning. Learning, of course, which we do by perception and by action. But with the kind of language available in Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha's writings, we are aided in the rebuilding of our ship of concepts, timber by timber. This is language that, whether you believe or not in Baha'u'llah's divine inspiration, can be of immense help and can speed the learning process regarding how we think of the norms, the values, the principles, the concepts that can provide for a much sounder world that we might then learn to have in view. Certainly, humanity faces such enormous challenges of the environment, gross inequities, continued racism and prejudice, and on and on. We can do that with renewed confidence in the power of the human mind in its exercise of perception and judgment. If we access the language of revelation, we can go deeper into a way of recognizing the values and purposes that contribute to how we think about the world. Yes, we're all confined to the limits of our own conceptions, but we also have to keep progressing in our learning. And this is possible, especially taking advantage of the way Baha'is have been learning over the past 25 years in our community building efforts. And there is progress to be made too in the journey of humanity as a whole. As long as we have enough conversation and discussion, if we make adjustments to our ship of concepts by which we navigate the world, replacing one beam of our ship after the other, and shape-shifting the world towards a view that is a better one. In the revelation of Baha'u'llah, one finds a comprehensive and coherent and logical set of concepts, along with the language that brings those concepts together in new and helpful ways that can enrich our understanding of the spiritual dimensions of reality for believer or non-believer alike. Now, in Davidson's language of the mental domain, unlike the domain of physical description and explanation, we reason by way of interpretation, not description, regarding our beliefs, feelings, memories, attitudes, imagination, possibilities, and so on, norms and values. And we also learn by the interpretation of others who we assume have the same challenging processes going on in their minds. This understanding that is interpretation is not a kind of pure description and explanation of phenomena that natural science involves. For interpretation always has a measure of indeterminacy that is important to the kind of creatures we are as human beings. Now, Baha'is also do rely on authorized interpreters like Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. Abdu'l-Baha's articulation of his father's revelation is very helpful, but we still have to learn by our own interpretation of how to understand him too in our own personal lives. The language of revelation that Baha'u'llah employs provides humanity with a reservoir of language that may allow humanity, if we make use of it, and you don't have to believe in God or Baha'u'llah to actually read the Baha'i writings, we find there an appealing and appropriate language of the spirit, of the immaterial or spiritual forces, the meanings, the purposes, the attitudes, the emotions that are alive to us if we try to perceive them. Baha'u'llah refers to the power of speech and utterance and how he has instilled into every word a fresh potency. He cites Muhammad, quote, "We speak one word and by it we intend 170 meanings. Each one of those meanings we can explain." Genuine revelation language then has the capacity of both a level of indeterminacy and the capacity to extend its meaning, which then helps us to deeper penetration into the reality by way of our perceptual and purposeful capacities of mind. Language that incorporates concepts of a spiritual nature and their interrelationships often in figurative and constitutive ways that build sound concepts regarding the world we then have in view, can have a major influence on how we might learn new ways of perceiving the world, perceiving others, and how we can reason through our feelings, our attitudes, our beliefs, our norms, our values and purposes that then justify our actions. Our interactions with others can then take on a sense and feeling that is spiritual, not by turning away from the material dimension, for our language always has that feature in this plane of existence. It is often only by material means that we can advance our spiritual purposes, our feelings, and the cognitive appraisals of lives, but we can develop finer discriminations in how we see and hear the world, in both its material and immaterial aspects, in the material and spiritual dimensions of reality, relying on our rational faculty and our capacity for knowledge, and how language and perception can help us through to refining the standards of truth, the standards of the good, the right, and the beautiful that we employ in seeing and acting in the world and in making judgments about the world. The language of revelation provides this help by its multiplicity of expressiveness. It's metaphoric, analogical, figurative, it's direct, it's descriptive, it's explanatory, and always with different registers of attitude, feelings, and modalities. Genuine religious language is about unity, love, and understanding, moral qualities, and the living of a life that moves a person closer to God. It's surely then neither a great leap of faith or of argument to make the claim that the language we try our best to learn from, to draw on, to live with, and share with others, is a language that deals with those features of the world that can guide our perceptual attention in ways that allow us to see the world in the light of qualities, among others of love, mutual understanding, care, kindness, and justice. In doing so, we learn to see with our own eyes and not through the eyes of others. For what other ways of perceiving the world do we have but our own eyes? Recognizing that justice is my gift, is God's gift to thee, and the sign of his loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. Abdu'l-Baha writes, let them open wide their eyes and uncover the inner realities of all things. Our spiritual perception, our inward sight must be opened, as Abdu'l-Baha says, so that we can see the signs and traces of God's Spirit in everything. Everything can reflect to us the light of the Spirit. We need to accept the fact that the mind cannot be fully or completely explained by natural and physical science. The mind and human action has a degree of freedom that lies outside the laws of causality that natural and physical science must assume exists. But the Baha'i idea of mind goes one step further than most, but not all, contemporary philosophers in their persuasive arguments that science and description and explanation of the merely physical and natural cannot fully accommodate the capacity of the mind. And that is the idea, the Baha'i idea, that the mind is beyond, really beyond the physical and the natural by its relationship to the soul. The mind in its relationship with the soul may be dependent on the health of the brain and body, but it is not entirely of that world, for it reaches into a higher level of reality. Now, this sounds spooky or otherworldly, but we can, I believe, try to understand it in a way that brings our understanding well within a way of understanding the mind that still recognizes the constraints of the physical and natural, yet transcends those constraints in other ways. Before all else, God created the mind. Abdu'l-Baha cites this holy tradition on the first page of The Secret of Divine Civilization, writing, this supreme emblem of God stands first in the order of creation and first in rank. He refers to the intellect and wisdom as luminous lights, how grace and splendor derive from wisdom and the power of thought. Abdu'l-Baha then describes the mind as, quote, the power of the human spirit, the light that shines from it. The mind itself, reason itself, is an ideal reality and not tangible. So Abdu'l-Baha understands the mind as a set of, quote, powers within him of which nature is devoid. Or another quote, that man is superior to nature, and that the mind has spiritual powers. It's only physically that man resembles the lower creation. With regard to his intellect, he's totally unlike it. Now, the soul is spiritual outside of nature, to be sure, but so too is the human mind, to the extent it turns to the soul's aspirations and aims. It is then, in its inseparable relationship to the soul, spiritual, and we even want to say supernatural, without lending to the word supernatural that kind of spookiness or otherworldly connotation, because it is in fact our minds and our consciousness that is the closest to us and our human reality. But it is certainly a human reality. It needs to be understood as a reality of two dimensions, the material and the spiritual. It is a world that is in a world that is intensely materialistic and secular. The idea that the mind is beyond the physical and the material and is spiritual and above and beyond nature is an idea that is alien to our current culture. However, unless we understand that our minds are beyond and outside of nature, then we won't be able to look after nature as we should, nor look after our human relationships and the world of humanity as we should. Unless we realize who we are as human creatures, that we are different in kind and quality from animals and nature in the physical world, we won't be able to take the responsibility that is ours as spiritual creatures, looking after the natural world as we should, treating it in ways that preserve its integrity and health, and preserving our own human health, spirituality, and materially, both personally and collectively. As Baha'u'llah says, make your escape from the darkness that surroundeth you. Let your vision be world embracing, rather than confined to your own self. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Filson. I have a few questions here for you, but I would really ask as a lower form of human intellect, I think, if you could make your answers a little bit more simpler no, they don't have to be shorter, but simpler in the sense that I think the vocabulary was so philosophical and some of the questions are more down to earth, I would say, that I just wanted to ask you, and excuse my ignorance in what I am saying, but one of the questions has to do with, I think, the missing link that you mentioned, that you were going to speak about, and of course you did, but the question is, the mind is an intellectual thing. Whether one is a theist or atheist, one can believe in the mind. Baha'u'llah says, however, that it is the soul that recognizes God. How do you see the relationship between the mind and the soul? So you spoke about the mind and the soul as connected by spirituality, but how would you explain that in lay terms, let's say, that we can comprehend and process?
Well, there is the passage from Baha'u'llah in Summons of the Lord of Hosts, where he says, mind, spirit, and soul are a single reality. So I think it's important that we accept that the mind, soul, and spirit are a single reality. They're inseparable, but then their expressions is through a diversity of instruments. I think it's impossible to separate the mind from the soul. I think the mind is very much a part of the soul, but I can't explain that. I don't think even the rational faculty, the passage about the rational faculty, Baha'u'llah says near the end of that we can't understand it. We can't fully grasp what it is. And so I don't think there is any way to divide the mind and the soul. I think that's the problem that's the myth of artificial intelligence. That's the project of trying to reduce the mind by neuroscience to explanations of simple physical brain happenings. I don't think we can. I don't think we can go to that depth. We just have to rely on the powers of the human mind. I also don't think the mind should not be understood as simply intellectual. The mind is also affective. It has attitude. We cannot make a judgment unless we have attitude attached to it, or which is human agency, which is feelings. So that too is a thing that people have understood these intelligence tests, and they try to divide the cognitive from the affective. But the heart and mind, Baha'u'llah writes about the heart and mind. He says, ponder things in your heart. Well, in other words, think. There's no separation, I think, between the mind and the heart. Our society has separated the two.
I think that's the best explanation when Baha'u'llah says, ponder in your heart, when actually we are pondering in our mind, but if he is saying it's in our heart, then those two things are interchangeable and so connected that we can't disconnect them in any way, that to explain them as separate entities. Is that what you see it as?
Yeah. And he often uses the expression the mind and the heart. We cannot understand by the mind and the heart. That's the other passage that I used, is the mind and heart can't go beyond the conceptions that are ours. And it's constant through the writings. It's the mind, heart, the mind and the heart, which means basically our affective capacity and our intellectual capacity, and also our purposeful capacity. The philosophers have this wonderful word, conative. The conative is the purposeful, our intentionality about what we're doing and what actions we're taking. It all goes together. It's a seamless way that the mind works.
I understand. I have a question here. How do you reconcile the quote of Baha'u'llah regarding the limitations of our concepts? Gleanings, page 317. Such mind and heart can never transcend that which is the creature of their own conceptions and the product of their own thoughts.
Yeah.
And the prayer, O God, O thou who hast cast thy splendor over the luminous realities of men, shedding upon them the resplendent lights of knowledge and guidance, and has chosen them out of all created things for this supernal grace, and has caused them to encompass all things, to understand their inmost essence, and to disclose their mysteries, bringing them forth out of darkness into the visible world. So the person is asking for you to reconcile these two quotes, and if you could just talk about this a little bit.
This is my personal understanding, is that yes, we are constrained by our own conceptions and the concepts that we've learned, but that on the other hand, we're exhorted to keep learning new concepts. In other words, concepts have an enormous grasp on us. This was the observation of Hegel. He said that, look, we're bound by these concepts and we have to break free of them and see deeper into the reality of the world. And I think that's what Baha'u'llah is saying, is yes, you're bound by the conceptions and the concepts that you've built up and how you've learned about the world, but you also have to, by obviously reading the writings, having the value, the revelation of Baha'u'llah impact your mind and your soul, which it does at the same time, mind and the soul being a single reality. That's how we are enabled to continue to perceive and to try to perceive and penetrate by our perception, by the language of revelation, to see beyond the material aspect of life to those deeper spiritual realities, which are about love and human association, human unity, kindness, generosity, and those kinds of things. But too often in our culture, we're taught rather to see what isn't working, what is wrong with other people, to blame other people, rather than to try to see the good in other people and the spiritual qualities that other people have. So I mean, I think the two work together. I mean, the fact is we are limited by our conceptual take on the world, if you want to put it that way. But then we have to break free of those concepts. And unfortunately, our education, I mean, my own stilted education, I have great difficulty breaking free of all kinds of learned responses to the world, whether it's emotional and affective, or whether it's purposeful on the conative side, or whether it's cognitive.
But would you say that language then plays a big role in that cultural learning that we have?
That's right.
So the language is one of the sensible qualities that makes us human beings, but it also limits our understanding of the world around us.
Yeah, and it's the language of revelation, the word of God, that pushes us forward. that allows us to learn. Learn new concepts, new ways of understanding the world, new metaphors, new images, new ways of novel expressions that are there that you find in the writings. And the book by Charles Taylor, the language animal, is really remarkable in terms of the number of examples. It's just a deluge of examples about how language has allowed human beings to see more. Even in science, it's the language of entities and forces and causal relationships that have allowed us to perceive the natural world or the physical world in ways that are just astonishing. So that theory has that effect on us. The language of theory has that effect. The language of metaphor and imagery and so on has this other effect that pushes us forward into seeing all kinds of things that we wouldn't have seen before, combinations of qualities. I mean, that's how we can understand now abstract art. We understand abstract work because of the feelings and so on that allows us to have, the way music operates. Because music too is conceptual. I mean, I'm not saying that words are necessarily conceptual. Words are conceptual, but so too are images, so too are sounds, so on. So we understand everything in that it conceptually shaped awareness we have of the world, how we discriminate the world. And language plays a big part, and there's an interplay between language and the arts.
With regards to what you just mentioned about the divine word or divine revelation pushing man forward. This is something I think a lot of us have discussed with our atheist friends or non-religious friends. Their natural behavior can and is usually influenced by divine revelation, but they are not aware of it. So how do we discuss this? How do we contrast this with our friends who are not believers in God, let's say, but their behavior is defined by divine revelation over thousands of years?
I mean, that's a challenge. I mean, it really is a challenge. But even Jürgen Habermas, who is probably the most important philosopher of the last 50 years, even he now has come around to understanding that it is religion, primarily the Christian religion in his case, because he sees it from a Western perspective, a European perspective, that has allowed humanity to extend, to develop, and to progress as fast as it has. And that, as he puts it in one phrase, how does he say? He says the semantic power of religious language has yet to be matched by secular language. Some phrase like that, and that we have to really pay more attention to religion. But now, how do you do it? I don't know. I mean, there's a book by Robert Bellah called, I think it's The Evolution. It has to do with religion and evolution, where he traces how myth and then the religions have advanced the actual cognitive capacity of human beings. How religion leads the way in opening us to other vistas, other possibilities that lie before the future of humanity. But it's a struggle.
It certainly is. I have a question here that says, in this excerpt from the tablets of Abdu'l-Baha, we read, religion must conform to reason and be in accord with the conclusions of science. For religion, reason, and science are realities. Therefore, these three being realities must conform and be reconciled. A question or principle which is religious in its nature must be sanctioned by science. Science must declare it to be valid, and so on. Can you comment on that with regards to what we are talking about with the connection of these concepts?
Yeah, I do. I want to make clear that neuroscientists, in fact, there's one of the Institute for Studies in ISGP people that is a neuroscientist. She's doing her doctorate in California, I think. She recognizes the reductive project where people believe. I mean, this is not neuroscientists who are all claiming that you can explain the mind and consciousness by a neuroscientific understanding of brain happenings. I mean, that project is not a sensible project. I don't think it doesn't stand on science. The genuine science of neuroscience has developed all kinds of understandings which are helpful to keeping our brains healthy. I mean, I just read Sanjay Gupta's, the neurosurgeon who's a CNN commentator, his book Keep Sharp. It was very aptly named, since Shoghi Effendi said that in the future, the refinement and sharpening of the human brain would be important. So it is important that we continue those studies, and it's very important that we look into them. But they don't explain completely. They don't have a full accounting. They're necessary but not sufficient to explain the mind and the soul. So it's not these reductive projects of animal rationalities like human rationality or artificial intelligence can eventually generate consciousness and so on. These are popular scientific conceptions rather than genuine science. They're not based on genuine science. So I think that you have to make that distinction between reductive explanations of the mind. And I think these philosophers, some of them, Robert Pippin, Marcus Gabriel, and John McDowell, and so on, do it very, very well. And they do it in ways that are very much running in parallel with things that you find, certainly passages from Abdu'l-Baha, who sort of, I think of him as the philosopher of the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'llah was the poet. And I think it's very important that science has no total explanation of the universe. There's a philosopher and mathematician that William Hatcher used to cite, who says that there's no total explanation beyond a poetic explanation of the universe. Science is always focused on this phenomena or that phenomena or that phenomena, and that there is no total explanation of even physical reality possible to science. Because there's also another principle in science, and that is that evidence always underdetermines theory. In other words, theory is always less than the evidence that one can accumulate, because by accumulating more and more evidence, you're always changing theory. So theory never ends, scientific theory. And so we'll never arrive at a total explanation, even of the physical universe. So there's these ideas that one can explain the mind and the rational soul by these reductive projects that are very popular out there in newspapers and in the popular media, are not based on genuine science. Science is about evidence gathering. It's about gathering evidence that supports theories. And theories are always underdetermined by the evidence out there. There's always more evidence that will change your theory, which is why we had such arguments about the pandemic. I mean, the scientists, you have to listen to them. They're the best. They know the best about it. They know the most about it. But it is always going to change next week because there'll be more evidence coming in.
Right. Okay, I have one other question here. How do you consider the following statement Baha'u'llah presents in the Seven Valleys in light of philosophical analysis? Knowledge is one point which the foolish have multiplied. Would you like to comment on that?
I think it's wonderful because I tell you, philosophers are troubled people. And I became people accept the faith out of common sense, out of intuition, out of serendipitous events that happen in life, out of mystical experiences and so forth. I came to Baha'i faith through philosophy because of the fact that I had so many anxieties about what I knew. I had doubts. And that's how philosophy is. And there's been a real turn in the 20th century towards the limitations, or philosophy as therapy. And I'm not sure that Western philosophy will continue that much longer. I mean, it's really changing. I think it's the good part of philosophy is going to converge with things of the faith. When I became a Baha'i, I felt every Baha'i I met was a philosopher in a way. But it's the anxieties and the doubts and the skepticism and the cynicism and so on that push philosophers to do that. And I think that's a very important quote. I don't think there's a need necessarily for philosophy. And I think all the things I've said tonight, what we just need to do is have confidence in our rational faculty, have confidence in the mind, that the mind can penetrate the immaterial and the spiritual dimensions of life just as it does with the physical things of life. So I take that quote very much wholeheartedly as a kind of a critique of the philosophers. Although Abdu'l-Baha also said that philosophy is important, and there's a talk, and I have some of the quote somewhere, where he does say that philosophy, even materialistic philosophers, have contributed to humanity. But I think philosophy has a great deal to do with coming back to spirituality. Because I mean, there's always a room for philosophy, but I love that quote, and I think it's a warning to philosophers.
It's a warning for all of us. I'm sure. But okay, I have another question here. For Aristotle, the type of soul possessed by human beings, unlike the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul, the rational soul has the capacity for rational thought. But watching the relationship, I'm not sure if you have watched the documentary called My Octopus Teacher. But there's this person is quoting, but watching the relationship of an octopus with a human documentarian, I ask myself, don't animals also think in a more primitive way, creating logical deductions not encoded in their DNA through instinct? So this documentary, just as an explanation, shows the relationship between a man and an octopus that pretty much becomes his pet or his soulmate or his friend and his teacher over a period of 1 year, when he visits this octopus every day. So I think this person is asking about the way that the animal perceives us, and not only the way that man perceives thought and knowledge and thinking, but the way animal perceives not thought and knowledge and thinking. Could you please comment on that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, the animal rationality is extraordinarily impressive in many ways. But you see, with acute sensibility and sense equipment and acute memory of environments, if you put those two together, you can develop an idea of mind that is really powerful. I mean, but at the same time, you know, the dog wags his tail and is happy to see you, and you feel all warm and fuzzy because you're greeted by your pet dog. But a 2-year-old child will not do what a pet dog does. It'll meet you in a different way each time you come home, because that child has other things going on in his mind. He's not just reacting to your coming home the way an animal does. I mean, this idea that animal rationality is comparable to human rationality, I think, is one of my pet peeves, obviously, because Abdu'l-Baha says it. I mean, he says it very clearly. And remember that woman who asked him, will I have the dog in the next world? And Abdu'l-Baha's answer was very astute. He said, you will if you need it. But generally, dogs don't have souls that are immortal. I mean, we know that. We also know that from other things Abdu'l-Baha said. But the still animals are astonishing in the ways, and I do think there is a kind of a fundamental logic that animals must have. But it's always about particulars. They don't have universal, as philosophers call it, universal, and Abdu'l-Baha uses that term too, universal concepts, abstract concepts. It is all about particulars that they're able to read. They're able to, maybe their dogs can count and things like that, but they don't count by classes. They discriminate by these differential repertoires that they have of discriminating in environments in ways that are astonishing to human beings, but not like human thought. At least by what I read in Abdu'l-Baha and Gerald and some of the philosophers I read.
Yes. I just wanted to ask you then, there's this one question here. I find it a little bit more complicated. I'm going to read you the whole question. The mind is connected to the brain. The mind is part of the physical creation. We cannot speak of an immortal mind because the powers of the mind are dependent on the brain and will disintegrate at the time of death. But the soul, the master says, is entirely outside the order of the physical creation. So while the mind and the soul interact in this world, I understand that the soul is ultimately immortal, but not the mind.
Well, Abdu'l-Baha says very directly that the mind is not of nature in the physical world. Abdu'l-Baha uses the word mind, and that's the word that he uses.
Would you say then it's interchangeable with the word soul in this particular sense?
No, I don't think it is. I think the mind, I think, as Baha'u'llah says, the mind, spirit, and soul are a single reality. They are a single reality. And there is that passage about the next world that is obviously there is a quality of the mind that goes into the next world. It is not and also Baha'u'llah uses the term rational soul, and he uses the term rational faculty. I mean, there are all these terms that are very, very difficult to distinguish and discriminate. But obviously, Abdu'l-Baha says it very directly. He says it in a number of places. The mind is beyond nature. The mind is outside of nature. The mind is not of the physical realm. It is not of the natural world. Now, it is obviously like that with the soul, and I don't understand it. I don't think we're able to understand that. Maybe in the next world it'll be explained to us, or we'll know in the next world. But the soul, obviously, the soul is outside this reality. But other things you read in the writings, the mind is also. Now, the mind is dependent on the brain, but it's the expression of the mind that is dependent upon the brain. And there's that image that the brain, in being clouded or not working properly and dysfunctional in certain aspects of it, will block the light that the soul, or the rational soul, or even, as you could say, the rational faculty has in seeing the world. I mean, I have a daughter who's handicapped, mentally handicapped. She fasts. Now, why does she fast? She came down one day and she says, "Why are you fasting? I'm going to fast too." And so she's fasted all her life. She's fasted since she was like 20 years old or something like that. Well, obviously there's some kind of thing going on there in her mind and her rational soul that is able to penetrate the veils and the difficulties of her mind, of her brain, her physical brain, that allows her to understand certain things. So I think these are questions that are very, very difficult. And I think maybe neuroscience will help to kind of solve them. I mean, neuroscience knows a lot about the brain, but it only knows the brain insofar as the brain is a vehicle of the mind in its expressions, but also is a vehicle that sometimes doesn't work very well. The transmission goes, and we have problems communicating and giving expression to the mind. So I think once we pass away and the physical side decomposes, the soul is a single entity. That much we know. The soul is a simple. It is not composite. So what does that mean? God is not composite either. There's no composition to God. So I don't know these questions. I don't think philosophy would be able to answer these. I don't think scientists can answer these.
Right. Well, as part of that, maybe the other question here is, according to Merriam-Webster, the rational soul is defined as the soul that in the scholastic tradition has independent existence apart from the body, and that is the characteristic animating principle of human life as distinguished from animal or vegetable life. Would you say that for the Baha'is, the definition of rational soul is a bridge between the spirit and the mind?
There is a letter to New Zealand from the Guardian, from Shoghi Effendi, where he talks about the body, the mind, and the soul. And the mind, I have it here somewhere, but I don't want to take the time to look for it. The mind interacts between the soul and the body. So there is that feature too. But then, of course, you have to put that beside the comment by Baha'u'llah that the mind, spirit, and soul are a single reality. They are a single reality, but they're diverse expression. They have diverse instrumentalities of expression. So again, these are issues that I don't have the competence or the insight to shed any light on them. But I don't think one should go to a dictionary for our understanding. I mean, dictionaries have a certain use, but not all that great, because language is always outrunning dictionaries.
Yes. There is one comment here. The answer might be found in the outward and inward powers in some answered questions.
Well, I've read all that.
Would you like to comment about that? That would be that.
Yeah, I mean, the outward and inward powers, that it's very true. And then there's I used a lot of some answered questions in some of the passages I used from Abdu'l-Baha this evening. And I have much longer paper on the same subject. And there's a common, what's it called? Not common faculty or common something that brings the two together. But I think, well, I don't have really I'd have to think a lot about that to answer that. I mean, I think it's an important issue, and I think some answered questions is very rich. And I've read all those sections related to the mind and to the outer powers and the inner powers and so on. But
the common faculty is that
the common faculty. That's it. Yeah. Which may be the rational faculty. And the rational faculty, because Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah's, the passage in the rational faculty from Gleanings, page 164, is about the fact that even our perception, our hearing, sight, our movement, our will, our purpose, all of that is involved with the rational faculty, and he includes in that perception. Just as he does in this single reality quote, he includes perception as part of that single reality of mind, soul, and spirit. John McDowell writes a lot about this. He's very difficult. He was a philosopher that Dr. Arbob read and talked about sometimes, and that is that McDowell talks about the cooperation between the conceptual and the sensibilities, and this is an issue that Kant, Hegel, and all the way up to Robert Pippin and all these other guys I've been talking about are still perplexed by and are still struggling with determining how one analyzes perception and mind.
I think we've come to the end here. I want to keep listening, and I really thank you for this very dense and very deep conversation we've been able to have here today. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, and if you'd like to close with a few words, or we could just open everyone's mic so that you can say hello to each other. I know that there are many people who haven't seen each other for decades, and sometimes this connection is a very lovely one to have. And it will not be part of our YouTube presentation, obviously, but we would be happy if everyone wants to just come in and chime in for a few minutes. Dr. Filson, would you like to close with a few words, or should we just open for everyone?
It's just a phrase from Baha'u'llah that I learned the other day, I read the other day, and that is that the domain of his decree is too vast for the tongue of mortals to describe, or the human mind to comprehend, and the domain of his decree or the domain, the dispensation of his providence are too mysterious for the mind of man to comprehend. And I think that that's an important thing to end on, is that there are mysteries in providence and in the domain of God's existence that are simply imponderables. So that I'll close on that note.
Thank you, though. That was really lovely. Thank you so much for being with us and for speaking to us about a subject so dense and so deep. Really, I enjoyed it very much, and I'm really grateful that you took the time to be with us tonight. If anybody would like to unmute and say hello, you're welcome to do so at this time. But we will be closing up this link in a few minutes.